Hello and welcome to the Honolulu, Hawaii monthly marketing report. I am Patrick ONeill, principal broker at Luxury Homes International. And with me today, the president of TZ Economics and one of the leading economists of the state of Hawaii. A big welcome to Mr. Paul Brewbaker. Paul, aloha Friday.
Aloha. King Kamehameha Day.
Oh, there you go. Okay, all right. Celebrate. Okay, represent.
Represent.
Okay, good. Well, as usual, much has happened since we spoke last. We're going to take a look at the housing statistics, which have just come out from the Board of Realtors. Again, setting price records. There's also potentially some evidence of a slowdown or a correction, which we're going to look at. I think probably not a big surprise to anyone. We also have interest rates. Are up. We're probably on the 30-year. We're over 5% right now. Going back to the beginning of the year, we had some deals closing even less than 3%, but certainly we have a jump there. We've got the Fed that's about to meet in about a week, expected to push rates further. We need to talk about that. And then finally, inflation, which appears that it's here to stay. I think we're now over 8% there. So, Paul, I thought we'd start the conversation with inflation. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, so
ripped from the headlines.
That's ripped from the headlines, exactly. So let me just share my screen here, and then we'll take a look at. You probably have some better, more current data than this. This was actually from yesterday, and I think you told me earlier that
This is from last month. So there's new data today, right? The May 2022 U.S. inflation rate was 8.6%.
8.6.
March was 8.5. So it's been 8.5, 8.3, 8.6, kind of 8 point something.
Does that mean anything to you?
Well, the fact that it's kind of been in the same neighborhood for 3 months is interesting, because it means that liftoff we saw beginning about 14 months ago may have reached its end.
I see. And looking at that, how do you think the Fed will react to these numbers? Is there any change in strategy, policy?
If you watch, Bloomberg TV, like I do sometimes in the morning, or CNBC, people are ripping their hair out. But I think the Fed meeting next week is going to say, yep, 8.6. That's kind of right in the zone. And so my interpretation would be a validation of what has been expected, that inflation would reach a number like 8 to 8.5%, or let's call it 8.5%. And then as things work out with the supply chain and whatnot, begin the descent, not just because of the resolution of disruptions on the supply side, or the end of fiscal stimulus impacts on consumption behavior, but also because the Fed itself has responded to the sort of the core part of the inflation rate, which has nothing to do with the invasion of Ukraine and the price of wheat, but everything to do with underlying macroeconomic aggregate demand pressures that they're in a position to tamp down.
And can you talk for just a moment, the inflationary pressures we feel today, looking back at other historical periods with high inflation in the U.S., is this different? Well, how is this different?
So, in the first place, we just had a pandemic. That's different. But second, I think what distinguishes this inflation event is that it's been so long since we had a real one, that everybody is just loving beating on this dead horse. But it is kind of a dead horse, because we know that the aggregate demand part of the inflation, which is about half, maybe more, of the inflation, is coming from the legacy of pandemic relief and federal fiscal policy response, the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of December.
So just to clarify, you're saying all the money that was pumped into the system is one of the causes.
$5 trillion, which turns out would have been fine at 4, but you don't know that at the time, right? It's triage, right? So you do everything you can to get the patient to the emergency room. You don't worry about, can I budget afford this extra Band-Aid?
Right.
And so in retrospect, in March 2021, by the time we got to the American Recovery or something, blah, 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 ARPA, right? Somewhere between CARES at 2 million, CAA at 1 trillion. I'm sorry, 2 trillion in CARES, 1 trillion in CAA, and another 2 trillion in ARPA. You know, the last 2 trillion, maybe one would have done it. I'm, you know, in retrospect, hindsight's 2020, blah, blah, blah. But because of the unleashing of consumption that occurred at some point in that process, but more at the end than at the beginning, and the fact that, you know, at the moment everybody was able to get vaccinated, the last checks came in the mail and people got their PPP loans. You know, the what do you call it? They waived, right? They didn't have to pay back their loans. And oh, thanks for the money, bro. That got us through 2021 with a lot more energy at a time when factories were still being shut down in Shanghai, when the empty containers were on the wrong side of the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that supply chain disruption that occurred as recovery unfolded, and some of which is being resolved this year, created inflationary pressure, on top of which, you know, a recovery in oil prices that always comes with economic recovery generally, but then was exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which turns out is, as we should have known or recalled, the breadbasket of Europe, if not North America, and therefore is having a big impact, say, on grain prices. Those kinds of microeconomic effects compounded the macroeconomic effects, or if you think of it in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the demand shock that came from households and businesses being provided with relief to get them through the downturn, or to bring about a faster economic recovery, was augmented by the aggregate supply shocks that are happening in the commodity space.
And Paul, oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say the latter tend to resolve themselves, right? Because at $120 a barrel, you now have a big incentive to pump more oil out of the ground. I have lost track of the price of corn, but pre-COVID, it was about $3.50 a bushel. And the last I looked, it was about $7 a bushel. So when the price of your agricultural output has doubled and it's time to plant for the new season, you're more likely to go where the returns are going to be, you know, highest, and that's where whichever commodity you're producing. Now, all of this is complicated by droughts, et cetera, et cetera. Again, things the Fed really can't control. About half of what we're seeing out there, the Fed can control. About half has to be resolved by market forces.
And how does this differ from, let's just say, the 1970s when inflation was spiraling? What's the difference?
Yeah, you hear this in the media all the time. This is the highest inflation in 40 years. That's because the last time we had supply shocks of this magnitude was 40 years ago, right? The Arab oil embargo that followed the Yom Kippur War in the fall of 1973, and there we have it, yet another war, causing disruption in the global petroleum market, or the Iranian Revolution in 1979, on both of which occasions OPEC, then a relatively new organization on the geopolitical stage, in a position to flex its muscles in a way that previously was latent but had never really been exercised. That event 4 years ago is the most similar thing we have to the current event, in that these aggregate supply shocks are at work. And at that time, it took a monetary policy intervention of much more draconian proportions, because at the time the Fed had not earned the credibility it subsequently did as an inflation bulwark. Today, the Fed is perceived as credibly committed to reducing the aggregate demand part of the inflation, and has already signaled through forward guidance, like telling us what they're going to do and then fulfilling the expectation that they built through the forward guidance by following through with interest rate increases.
And Paul, any relief on the horizon from interest rates the remainder of this year? I think we're going to be kind of bouncing around in these upper single digits.
No, and for there's at least another 100 basis points to go at the overnight rate, but at the 30-year, part of the term structure of interest rates, right? For the 30-year mortgage, nobody's waiting around for the Fed to validate. The 30-year mortgage rate went straight from 3% to 5% like a light switch. Well, how far is the Fed going to go? Well, we're going all the way. And in fact, if you look at Treasury yields, around 3 or maybe 3.25%, but if you look at the 2, the 5, 10, and 30-year yields on Treasury notes, they're all up in that 3 to 3.25 range, where most people expect the Fed will end up, and where the Fed itself in recent years has indicated is kind of the stopping point. That's the other thing. The Fed tells us what they think is the end point. Here's where we are now. Here's our expectation of where we end up. What do you think? And that had come down a little to something more like 2.5%, but 2 years ago it was 3%.
So right now we're at high single digits. You think for the rest of the year we're probably going to bounce around in that range?
Well, mid single digits, right? We're at 5% for the.
Oh, sorry, inflation rates. Inflation rates.
Oh, yeah.
Just to wrap up on inflation.
Well, sure. Let's take a look at like the bumper stickers say, this is not the mainland. So let's look at the Hawaii numbers just for a second. Here's the timeline, right? Everything's in alignment pre-COVID. The two measures of inflation I've illustrated here are the so-called headline rate, which is called the headline rate because it's the one in the headlines, and then what's called the core rate, which removes food and energy prices for those who don't drink, drive, or eat. And around the time of the last fiscal stimulus, I've indicated where the CARES Act dropped, the CAA, and the ARPA, and about the time vaccination became available and changed, the anticipated path of economic recovery, these two time series split apart. And if you break down where Hawaii inflation, which is at 7%, not 8.5%, where you break down those components, well, 2 percentage points of the inflation is what we already had. So we were going to be on that path anyway. And then about 4 percentage points is this core part without the food and energy. And then if you add in the part that's attributable to food and energy, it's these last 3 percentage points. So the last 3 percentage points are coming from the supply chain disruption, so to speak. And the 4 percentage points of the Hawaii inflation of the total 7, 4 percentage points of the part the Fed's trying to tap down.
I got you. Yeah, and we feel all of it for sure everywhere.
Oh yeah, you feel it at the grocery store, and it's rewarding people who work from home. It's rewarding people who put PV on their roof and bought an electric car.
So just see if I can have you tie you down a little bit. Where do you think we are as we head into the end of this year?
So my personal opinion is that this is it. Yeah, no, this is it. 8.5% for the U.S., 7.5. We briefly had 7.5 in Hawaii, but the number in May was 7. I think we're done, and all of the effort that's been put into tamping down the aggregate demand part in terms of monetary policy, plus the fact that the fiscal stimulus is over, it's gone, right? It's not there anymore. As that all burns off, the number should recede, and then you're left with oil and food prices. Well, if there's a bumper crop, presuming the higher food prices have led people to plant more, or the wheat farmers in Saskatchewan and North Dakota who realize that Ukrainian grain is not going to be available this harvest have planted additional amounts. All of those kinds of responses will and the fact that the container ships are no longer stacked up at Long Beach and San Pedro and so on and so forth. There are other logistics issues, intermodality, multimodality, problems that are being worked out in the supply chain. But even the factories in Shanghai are being turned, the robots are being turned back on now that the latest Chinese COVID surge has been managed. So, both macro and micro forces, both aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors, should settle out over the next year or two.
So potentially we are on maybe the next month or so we float around in these rates, but then we start to begin a deceleration of inflation throughout the rest of the year.
That's true. The bad news for mortgage rates is the right number probably was 5%.
Well, hold that thought, because we're going to come back and we're going to talk in depth about the interest rate. So we're going to take a real quick break. We'll be right back with economist Paul Brewbaker. So stand by. Okay, and welcome back. We're here with economist Paul Brewbaker. And Paul, coming up June 30th, we have our annual mid-year real estate review. It's going to be our 13th year we've done this together.
I know.
It's great. And it's such a deep dive. We're probably going to have an hour plus of you. And I can't wait. And I've told you
than anybody really wants. Trust me.
Well, I'll tell you this. I've told you before, my wife will not make any real estate moves until after she hears you at the mid-year real estate review.
No,
So
don't wait.
Don't wait.
Buy the house of your dreams.
Okay, so we're just about to talk about interest rates, and we're talking about interest rates as they relate to real estate. So what are your sort of projections right now? Let's just use a 30-year approximate, or maybe around five-ish. What are your projections looking out through the rest of the year? So
we talked about this a second ago. The long end of the Treasury yield curve, the 30-year yield on the 30-year Treasury bond, yields on 10-year Treasury notes, and so on. They're already up around 3%. Which, if you add the risk premium that's associated with mortgage lending, means mortgage rates around 5%. It's in that neighborhood. And so the long end of the curve and the long-term mortgage rate that's applicable is pretty much in the neighborhood of where it would have ended up anyway. And one way to think of that, right, past performance is no guarantee, blah, blah, blah. Those who forget the past are condemned to retweet it. But I mean, you can just look at the data. If you just go to FRED, which is the St. Louis Federal Reserve, you can just pull these data and see that the 5%, 5.13, I think it was yesterday, the 5% mortgage rate we're looking at now goes right back to where it was pre-COVID, when the Fed was normalizing interest rates, and goes right back to the early 2010s when the Fed thought things were going back to normal. As it turned out, inflation over the course of the decade was lower than the 2% goal that they articulated in 2012. But you can sort of see from the picture that in terms of the last decade of economic performance, that things go back, the mortgage rate goes back to about 5%. That's the moral of that story. And this time the Fed's gone, the mortgage rate's gone right back to that number. Now, how does that affect sales? Well, this is going to make your brain hurt. But
well, let me ask you a question. This is probably where you're going with this. But let me ask you a question. Conventional wisdom. Interest rates go up, real estate market slows down.
Yes.
Interest rates go down, real estate market goes up. I can certainly think of times when the interest rates were low and the real estate market did not go up. I don't know that I can think of the opposite. Is there? I mean, it's not always true, right? And
because other things matter, right? If other things equal, that is, abstracting from other factors, a higher interest rate is associated with a higher carrying cost for a monthly mortgage payment, and therefore less house in terms of what people can afford to pay for or desire. Part of it is, they behave strategically. They know that at some point they know that interest rates move up and down. So when they think about, when they move and so on and so forth, when they swap houses, they're taking into account the fact that there might be a moment in the future where the interest rate will be higher and lower. But at any rate, the basic inverse relationship between mortgage interest rates and the demand for housing is an accurate one, but it is subject to other factors. And so in the middle of a housing bubble, when your Uber driver is giving you advice on where to buy houses, because everybody seems to be making money in the housing market, that in those environments, the interest rate may not matter as much as the sheer momentum, right? The herd going over the cliff or whatever, right? The House and Garden television having marathons as the TV show Flip This House.
Right.
In those kinds of environments, and we've gone through bubbles like that here in Hawaii and nationwide, in a bubblicious environment, interest rates aren't as determinative. And in fact, many people would argue post-COVID that we had kind of a bubblicious episode. We had a little flight to detached dwellings on balance. I mean, not as much of a demand surge in condos as in single family homes that seem to be associated with remote work and work from home and kind of a change in the way the labor force is structured, and an increase in the number of workers and households who, because they no longer had to commute on a daily basis, were inclined to live farther away from work.
So there are times when that conventional wisdom doesn't hold because of all the other factors. Have there been times when rates have been higher and volume has increased? Anything that you're aware of?
Well, we just looked at interest rates over the last decade, and you saw they started out at 5%, they've ended up at 5%, and during the course of the decade, mortgage rates went up and down, mostly staying below 5%, but once or twice returning to that number. And yet we know all through the decade, up until the COVID moment, sales were rising. And we know that after the COVID moment, after about a 3-month hiatus, sales rebounded yet again. So it's not clear if you just think in the abstract about, well, sales continue to rise all through the last decade, whether rates were high or low. It's not clear that the inverse relationship is that powerful. But it turns out you can test for that, and I can show you it. Shall we take a look?
Let's take a look.
Like I say, it'll make your brain hurt. But
okay.
So here are the condo sales in the dark blue dots, and the single family sales. These are Oahu monthly home sales for the last 10 years. Well, July 2009 through February 2020. So it's a pre-COVID benchmark. And you see them snaking up, but not in a straight line. They snaked upward right there from 225 sales per month, 250 to 275 to 300 to 350. But then they also went around in the single family segment. You've seen the same thing in condos, going kind of around and around a couple times. The general trend was upward. It turns out and here I'm mapping against the interest rate on the x-axis, right? So these diagonal lines tell you, if you're just talking about the impact of the interest rate, a 5% mortgage rate over here on the right side of the graph is associated on average with fewer sales than a 3% mortgage rate. That's what that slope is telling you. So the effect holds even when other forces are working on demand and supply, right? The numbers of people who are listing their homes, the number of people out there looking for a home. And by the way, the estimate I got, I only did this because you asked me to look at it, is that moving from a 3% to a 5% mortgage rate should reduce sales by about 15%. Other things taking into account these other things that are going on. So I'd expect, now there's a lag, right? Because rates went up in March, but somebody who went under contract in March won't have shown up in the closed sales statistics until May. And so I don't think we really see the full effect of a 5% mortgage rate until June, July, August data that are forthcoming.
So I have something we're going to look at in a moment, which I think is going to potentially confirm what you just said.
Okay.
So we'll take a look. I have another question for you, Paul. Is there anything, a scenario? What's the scenario where suddenly rates go from 5 to 10? What would have had to have happened in our economy and our macro level? Or what's the scenario where rates suddenly fall back down to 3%? Yeah. Talking over any sort of a time frame.
Well, just for historical reference, in the US modern context, something like that actually happened between 1965 and 1980. So over a period of a decade or a decade and a half, between a variety of fiscal stimuli, from the war on poverty to the war in Vietnam to global shocks in petroleum and other commodity prices, from everything from wars and other geopolitical catastrophes to weather-related events and so on, droughts and so on. Something like that happened in the 1970s, at which point ending in double-digit inflation and double-digit interest rate territory, a really severe monetary policy-induced economic contraction had to be engineered. The lesson from that experience is that if the monetary authority is credibly committed, as we now believe it is, to preventing or preempting something like that from happening, and that's what the Fed is engaged in right now, then the odds of going past this 5% mortgage rate are relatively low. It can happen if it, and you asked what could make it happen, something really getting out of control at this point. And you can't rule it out because A, we just had a pandemic, and B, Russia just invaded Ukraine, and C, now there are 3 cases of monkeypox on the island of Oahu. So you can't rule out catastrophic. We're supposed to have a mild hurricane season until a hurricane hits Oahu. I mean, I'm just saying that wouldn't affect national interest rates, but it's possible for such events to occur. World War would do it, and Parrish thought that would happen, but nobody in January seriously was thinking about a war, a land invasion in Eastern Europe.
And what are some things that potentially that would happen to the economy where rates came back down? Would that just be a total meltdown of the economy?
I think that's what the Fed. It's worth listening to what the Fed says about this next week, because if they pull on the chain too hard, if they break the economy too aggressively, then an economy going into a more severe recession than the soft landing that they're trying to engineer would be that kind of event. Would follow with a collapse of investment demand.
Understood.
And a collapse not just in housing but other asset markets.
Okay. Well, Paul, let's take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to look at the pricing, and then we're going to look at some statistics that potentially relate to what you're saying about the slowdown. So stand by. We'll be right back with economist Paul Brewbaker. Okay, and we're back with economist Paul Brewbaker, and Paul, just about to talk about the market statistics, and I'm going to pull this up. This is from the Honolulu Board of Realtors. These statistics just recently released.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so let's start with pricing. The headline grabber, as you say, the headline news. We've set price records once again. It's almost like a broken record. So condos hitting a new price high. If we look year to date compared to last year, up just about 12%. If we look compared to 2 years ago, up almost 19% year to date. And then I thought this was interesting, month over month, only 1.3%. And let me jump over to single family, and then we'll talk about this. So single family also setting a new record, all-time record high. Looking at year to date compared to last year, 19%, a whopping over 40% compared to 2 years ago. And again,
20 plus 20 is 40.
Yeah, I could do that math. And then but the month over month also low single digits. Does this say anything
Okay.
to you or no?
First of all, ignore month to month.
Okay.
And then, I think it's significantly, 19% with compounding, 19% over 1 year, call it 20 with compounding, with 40
Okay.
over 2 years is a lot higher than in condos, which is 12% or 18 or 19% over 2 years.
Right. We definitely
And
see that separation. We've seen it since the
that's
beginning.
we've
There's
seen that
been
for
no
a
doubt.
while, yeah.
Yeah. And
That
I
does
know.
mean that
Mhm.
condos remain a bargain. So I'd expect the condo market from an affordability standpoint, even with higher interest rates, maybe to hold up a little better over the summer. The single family homes are, if there's going to be, some dropout, will probably be up in that 1.2 million dollar
Yeah.
range.
And I'll point out the majority of sales growth in the condo market was under 900,000. That's where it's all been. And I guess probably not a big surprise. Okay, so let's go back to this one more time. And then this, I think, is where things start to get rather interesting. So when we look at the sales data, this is backwards looking, so to speak, right? Because these are deals that went into escrow 3 months ago or whatever we want to call the time frame. But now if we look at pending sales, this is a measurement of what went into escrow, what went into a sale last month. So I think this is more of a real-time measure. And if we look at these numbers, single family homes down 17% year to date. This is a big number. We haven't seen any declines, I think, through this
year over year.
Year over year. And then if we
Right.
look at condos down 14%, this seems to relate directly to what you said earlier, going from a 3% interest rate to a 5% interest rate theoretically results in a 15% decrease. Is that what we're seeing here?
Yeah, in fact, compare the 17% and the 14%, which are year over year changes just for May, single family and condo. Compare -17 and -14 to the year to date decreases, which at the bottom of the table here are -11 and -0.5. That is, the change in May was larger, the decrease was larger by the time you got to May than it was if you include the early months of the year where interest rates were still 3%. So that acceleration to the downside is appearing in the window during which interest rates went from 3 to 5%.
And do you think this is something we'll see continue?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I see.
In
So
fact, think about this for a second. If sales sorry, I lost my train of thought, but the point is sales are retreating to a volume that we may be associated with the summer of 2020, right? Because they're already down 15 to 20% from 2021, which was up 15 to 20%, round numbers.
right.
So we should definitely be seeing some of that subsidence in sales volume.
Yeah, anecdotally, I think we're seeing inventory sit on the market a little bit longer. It's not showing up in the statistics yet because that's looking again backwards. But I think anecdotally that's kind of been true. Sort of the
actually, I
scuttlebutt.
have that picture here. Check this out.
Okay, let's see it.
So these are single family and condo sales volumes measured in terms of standard deviations. So what I've done here is, if you just think about the average for the last 5 years, right? Where were sales plus or minus a couple standard deviations? And right after COVID, they were 2 standard deviations below the average. So like 0 would be the average, yeah. But then after COVID, in the fall of 2000 and the early part of 2001, see how they surged upward? More recently, the single family ones have dropped off a little bit. They're still above average, but they're retreating. And the condos, which remain high, are vulnerable because even though they're more affordable, are still their buyers are still being confronted with the higher interest rate
Yes. Okay.
than they saw before.
So putting this all together, we started off with inflation. We're looking at interest rates. We're looking at potentially the slowdown in pending sales. As you look towards the rest of this year, do you think we'll see a little more increasing inventory, maybe even some softening of prices?
Yeah, and that premium that people were paying above list price, that we should look for evidence that that's retreating a little bit. The ideal, the soft landing in the economy that the Fed's looking for by engineering through higher interest rates, a bit of a slowdown, should be matched by a soft landing in Oahu's housing market that involves sales settling back to where they were pre-COVID, the average we were just looking at, and prices, which did go up, prices converging back to the old appreciation rates of 4 to 5%.
Which would be a regression back down for single family condos.
The prices wouldn't go down. The prices wouldn't go down. They just go back to the old path after having jumped 20%. See what I mean?
I do. This sounds like the theory of the plateau and prices never go down.
Yeah, well, in the past when prices did go down is because the bubbles were so excessively energetic that they went too high. I don't think we had that this time. We flirted with it, and there may be more vulnerability in the single family market segment than there is in the condo segment. In fact, you and I have looked at this before, but it's worth looking again and including the main numbers. These condo prices only have returned to the pre-COVID path in the last year and a half, whereas single family prices we see lofted well above that trend, but that curvature shows that they were doing so at a decreasing rate of increase. So again, I think a soft landing is possible for Oahu's housing market in the sense of kind of going back to something a little less frenetic than we saw in the summer of 2021.
All right. Well, Paul, thank you so much for the time today. It's always a true pleasure. June 30th, we'll do a deep dive, which that's biggest highlight of the year. Yeah.
You just gave away all the good stuff today.
That's right. And
preview of coming attraction.
Preview of coming. And we will play the replay of that video here on this channel. So if you like this today, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. And Paul, have a fantastic day. Everybody out there, stay safe and aloha.
Aloha.